Alright, here in this video we discuss the agreement on audit engagement terms, and that's in section AUC section 210.09 and 10. And so it says the auditor should agree upon the terms of the audit engagement with management or those charged with governance as appropriate. And also that those terms of the audit engagement should be documented in an audit engagement letter or other suitable form of written agreement, and it should include the objective and scope of the audit of the financial statements. It should include the responsibilities of the auditor, the responsibilities of management. It should also include a statement about how the inherent limitations of an audit, as well as the inherent limitations of internal control, make it to where an unavoidable risk exists that some material misstatements may not be detected, even though the audit was properly planned and performed in accordance with GAAS. The engagement letter should also include the applicable financial reporting framework that's used to prepare the financial statements, and it should also reference the expected form and content of any reports to be issued by the auditor. And it should also say that circumstances might arise where a report may differ from its expected form and content. So it's pretty straightforward. Typically, these items will be in a template of an engagement letter that you can modify to fit the particular client we're working on. But let's go down to the reference paragraphs 20 through 26 to get some more color on what all we need to include in the audit engagement letter. Okay, so here we're in the explanatory material section, 210.820, to discuss more about the agreement on audit engagement terms. So here it says that, depending on the size of the entity under audit and how complex it is, the audit engagement letter and the agreement on the terms might be with management, or it might be those who are charged with governance, or it could be both. But in either instance, management still has to agree and acknowledge that it understands its responsibilities. And in a prior video, we saw that those responsibilities were the premise, and that they're required, or it's their responsibility for the fair presentation of the financial statements, for implementing internal controls, as well as giving the auditor access to all the information he needs to do the audit. And that should be in the engagement letter that he acknowledges those responsibilities. And that even includes if a third party has contracted for the audit. Still, somehow we need to get the acknowledgement from management that they understand their responsibilities and establish the preconditions for an audit that we saw in a prior video. Next, we discussed some more about that these terms of the engagement need to be in a written form. Typically, that's in an engagement letter. And that helps to avoid misunderstandings with respect to the audit. It also helps to reduce the risk that management might inappropriately rely on the auditor to protect them against certain risks or to perform certain functions that are management's responsibility. For example, their responsibility for the financial statements and internal controls and such. So we want to make it clear in written form that they understand that responsibility so they don't inappropriately rely on the auditor for those things. So next we get down to the form and content of the audit engagement letter. So what should it look like? It could be different for different types of entities, but generally there are several things that are included. And so that first includes the management's responsibilities. For instance, for the presentation of financial statements and internal controls, provide us with all the information we need. And also the engagement letter should tell the scope of the audit. And that includes reference to legislation, regulations, GAAS, and other items that the auditor adheres to. Also, it should discuss other communications the auditor might make in reference to the engagement, so outside of just his opinion, but other communications. For instance, the internal control deficiencies and material weaknesses is a requirement to report those to management. Also, arrangements regarding the planning and performance of the audit, including the composition of the audit team. So, for instance, the timing of when the audit reports due, or when different stages are to be completed, and whose responsibility on the audit team those areas are. Should also include that management is supposed to provide written representations that it has acknowledged its responsibilities, and also some other areas that are part of the substantive procedures of the audit. And the engagement letter should also include an agreement of management that it will provide the information that the auditor needs on a timely basis so that the auditor can reach his deadline. It should also state that management will inform the auditor of any subsequent events. So those are any material facts discovered after the financial statement date that management is aware of that may affect the financial statements. So we may learn of things that happened after the financial statement date that may affect the accounts or the perceived or the economic perceptions of users of the financial statements. The engagement letter should also contain the fees and billing arrangements. So how often is the client going to be billed and for how much? And also a request for management to acknowledge receipt of the audit engagement letter and agree to the terms of the engagement that are outlined in it. And they also need to sign it. So those are the key pieces that should go into the audit engagement letter, as well as the premise that we discussed before, that management acknowledges its responsibilities. There's also a few other items that may go into the engagement letter if they're relevant. And And that might be discussions if other auditors are or specialists are involved in the audit. So if the audit firm is hiring a specialist to do a complex area of the audit for them, and they're relying on that auditor's work, then they should inform management through this engagement letter. And if the auditor plans to use internal auditors, for example, within the entity, then they should maybe say so in the engagement letter. If there are any involved arrangements to be made with the predecessor auditor, then that should be included. For instance, auditors required to review the work papers of the predecessor auditor when he's accepting a new engagement. So that might be included in the audit engagement letter as well. And also the engagement letter might include restrictions on the auditor's liability, obligations the auditor might have to provide audit documentation to other parties, for instance, maybe regulators, additional services to be provided, for instance, those related to regulatory requirements, maybe in a single audit, the audit of the entity's compliance with its contracts for federal funds. An audit engagement letter might also reference further agreements between the auditor and the entity. For instance, maybe it's also performing or preparing its tax return or other non-attest services. So we make note here that the auditor should not describe the type of opinion that's expected to be expressed. For instance, the auditor shouldn't say in the engagement letter that it's expecting to express an unmodified opinion, because we don't know that just yet because we haven't performed the audit. And so there's an example of an audit engagement letter in this AUC section at the back, and we'll take a look at that here in just a second after we go through this last point. The last point is that sometimes the auditor will be auditing a parent entity which is also composed of various components. And in some cases, the auditor might need to get an engagement letter from both the parent and the components. And the determination of whether to do that depends on who engages the component auditor, whether a separate auditor's report is to be issued on the component. So if there's an audit report on the parent and a different audit report on the component, maybe we need to get an engagement letter for both entities. Our decision may also be dependent on legal requirements regarding the appointment of the auditor, degree of ownership by the parent, and degree of independence of the component management. So maybe if the parent has less control through its ownership or its management on the component, then the component may be considered more of a separate entity and may need a separate engagement letter. Okay, so here we have an example of an audit engagement letter, and this is a good template here, and it's not authoritative, and it's only intended to be used as a guide. And so every engagement letter with every client will not be structured the same as this one. You'll have to modify to for the circumstances of that particular client and the engagement that you're working on. But generally, the engagement letter should include all of the previous disclosures that we discussed, and from there you can modify it as you see fit. And as we kind of skim this a little bit, we'll see certain items that we discussed previously that should be included. For instance, we're addressing it to either those charged with governance or management. We include the objective and the scope of the audit. For instance, we give specifically exactly what we are auditing, ABC company as of this date, with these financial statements, including the footnotes. And then we have the responsibilities of the auditor. For example, we're performing the audit under GAAS, and then it explains exactly what does that mean and what does it involve. And it includes our professional judgment, assessing the risk in the statement, and a few other items. Also, it mentions the inherent limitations of an audit, and a statement that we may not be able to uncover all material misstatements because of that risk due to inherent limitations of the audit, even though we plan the audit appropriately. So remember that was a bullet point from above. And we also alert them that we'll be taking a look at their internal control, but that we're not providing an opinion on that internal control. We're only using the internal control as a means of risk assessment. But remember another bullet point from above that to provide other communications we might provide to them about the audit. And for instance, one of those may be the significant deficiencies that we're supposed to provide to management. And then that was the responsibilities of the auditor. And next we have the responsibilities of management, and that includes the premise. We remember this from a prior video, where the management acknowledges and understands for fair presentation of the financial statements, for the design and implementation of internal controls, and also to provide us with all the information we need in order to perform the audit. That means records and documents, as well as other information and access to the people that have that information. And also warns them we will require written representations from them. And remember that as being a bullet point from above. And also included will be the fees and the billing frequency and amounts and such. And then next we discuss what our audit report might look like, as well as other reports that might be issued. And then we require their signature. So in general, these are the key elements of the engagement letter. And of course you can modify it in a way that fits your purposes, but generally all of these items should be included.